I've buried 3 men on this property. My father, a drifter who died of fever before I could learn his name, and a boy, can't have been older than 16, who rode onto the ranch one February with a bullet already in him and was gone before the sun moved 2 hands across the sky. I marked each grave myself, dug the earth, set the stone, said what words I knew. That's the rancher's duty in a country that doesn't care whether you live or grieve or simply disappear into the landscape. I thought I understood death on this land. I thought I understood what it meant to be alone out here, the particular weight of silence that settles over the high desert after the wind stops, when the cattle have bedded down, and the only sound is the creak of the porch boards under your boots and the distant hiss of the arroyo running shallow over rock. I was wrong about all of it. I was wrong the morning she came out of the cedars running like the earth itself was trying to swallow her, and I stood at the fence post with a hammer in my hand and my mouth open, understanding nothing, while behind her the riders were already cresting the eastern ridge. What I'm about to write down, I'm writing for myself. I keep a log, have since my father first put a pencil in my hand and said a man who doesn't record what he's seen hasn't really seen anything. Most entries are cattle counts, water table readings, first frost dates. This one is different. This one I've started 4 times and crossed out 3. But here it is, what happened, what I did and didn't do. What I'm still not sure I understand, even now with the dust long settled and the ridge empty and her face still appearing behind my eyes on certain mornings when the light comes in at a particular angle. I'll write it true. The hammer was in my right hand. I remember that because I kept looking at it afterward, kept noticing it sitting on the fence rail where I'd set it down without deciding to set it down, the way your body sometimes acts before your mind has caught up to what it's seeing. A 12-ounce framing hammer, handle worn smooth from 15 years of use, sitting there on a cedar post, while the entire calculus of my life rearranged itself in the span of about 30 seconds. It was early. The light was still coming in low from the east, cutting across the scrub in long orange blades, making everything look sharper than it was. I'd been at the south fence since before full sunrise, replacing 2 posts that the cattle had leaned on and softened over the winter. Physical work, methodical. The kind of work I do best, which is to say the kind that doesn't require conversation. I live alone on this property. Have for 6 years, since my father passed and my younger brother Cal took his share in cash and went to Tucson to do whatever it is Cal does in Tucson, I've stopped asking. The ranch is 1,100 acres of high desert grassland in the southeastern territory, hard against the Dragoon foothills, and in the 6 years I've run it alone, I have become a man of specific habits and significant silences. I keep the log. I count the herd every morning. I talk to the horse more than is probably healthy. I wake before sunrise because sleep, for me, has always been something that happens in pieces. My name is Virgil Crane. I'm 34 years old. I have a scar across my left palm from a barbed wire incident I'd rather not explain, and I have a habit, my brother calls it an affliction, of writing down the precise time when anything significant happens. She came out of the cedar break on the eastern edge of my property at a dead run. Not a jog, not a hurry, a run. The kind of movement that has fear in it, the kind where the body has stopped consulting the mind and is simply going because going is the only remaining option. She was Apache, I knew that from her dress, the moccasins that reached her knees, the way she moved over the uneven ground with a fluency that spoke of a lifetime navigating this landscape. Her hair was loose, which I would later understand was wrong, significant in a way I had no framework for at the time, streaming behind her as she cut across the open stretch of rocky grass between the tree line and my fence. She hadn't seen me yet. I was low, crouched by the post, and for 2 or 3 seconds I just watched, not out of calculation, out of shock. You have to understand, I'd been on this land for 34 years, and the closest I'd come to any Apache was the occasional smoke in the distance, and once the sound of horses moving through the arroyo in the dark that my father had said to leave alone, and I had left alone. This is what settlers did, by and large, in this particular stretch of country. We left alone. The agreements were fragile and imperfectly understood, but they held mostly if you didn't push. She covered 50 yards in the time it took me to straighten. When she saw me, when her eyes found me in that low light, and she registered what I was, she didn't slow. That was the first thing that told me something was very wrong. A woman running alone across a stranger's land who spots a white man with a hammer in his fist and doesn't slow down is a woman for whom the stranger is not the most frightening thing in her current situation. She angled toward me. My brain said several things at once, none of them useful. My body said stand still, which is what I did. She reached the fence at a point about 30 feet from where I stood and went through it the way a person goes through a fence they've decided they're going through. She took the middle wire in both hands, pressed down, stepped over, and she was on my side and still moving, and then she stopped about 10 feet from me and we looked at each other. She was breathing hard, not winded, controlled, measured even through the exertion, the kind of breathing that speaks of serious physical conditioning, but hard. Her chest was working. There was blood on her left arm, a dark smear above the elbow that had dried dark against her skin, and something in her right hand that I couldn't make out immediately, held close to her side. Her eyes were extraordinary. I don't mean that in a sentimental way. I mean they were the eyes of someone who had already decided what was worth looking at and what wasn't, someone who assessed and categorized and moved on without wasted time. She looked at me for about 3 seconds with an expression that was not fear precisely, but something adjacent to it. Something more like the face a person makes when they're doing rapid arithmetic about bad options. She said something in Apache. I don't speak Apache. I shook my head, slow, deliberate, trying to communicate that I wasn't a threat without knowing what language to use. Then she looked past me, toward the western tree line that leads toward the arroyo and the broken hill country beyond. It was a look of measurement, of distance assessment. She was mapping an exit. Then the sound came. Horses, multiple horses, coming fast. Not from the cedar break she'd emerged from the north, which meant they'd anticipated her angle or they'd been riding parallel and farther out, and either way it meant they knew this land better than I'd have expected. I turned. There were 4 of them on the ridge. Then I looked again. 6, coming in a spread, not a line, which I recognized even from that distance as a deliberate pattern, designed to cut off angles of escape. They were Mexican, I thought, though in that light and distance I couldn't be certain of anything except that they were moving with purpose, and they were moving in a direction that ended at where we were standing. I turned back to the woman. She was watching me, still doing that arithmetic. "Get to the barn," I said. The words came out before I'd made any conscious decision to say them. She didn't move. "Barn," I said again, stupid. She didn't speak English. I had no reason to think she spoke English. I pointed. The barn was visible from where we stood, maybe 80 yards northwest, the old stone and timber structure my father had built in the first year of the ranch with help from a man I knew only as Delgado, who had died somewhere unrecorded. She looked at the barn, she looked at the riders, she looked at me. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, knowing it was useless. She turned and ran toward the barn. I stood there for a moment with the hammer in my hand, and the riders coming down the ridge and the particular feeling you get when a decision has been made, and you are now living inside its consequences. I set the hammer on the fence post. I still don't know why, some instinct about approaching armed men with empty hands, and I walked out toward the open ground to meet them. The thing is, I knew in some animal part of me what they were. I'd heard the word enough times in the right kinds of conversations. Skin hunters. Men who moved through the territory finding Apache camps or solitary travelers and taking what the territorial government offered, bounty money paid by the scalp. It was a trade practiced in shadow, denied by officials, but real in the way that ugly things are always real whether or not the polite world acknowledges them. I'd never seen one up close. I was about to. They pulled up short of me, not far short, maybe 15 feet, and the lead man controlled his horse with practiced ease. He was broad, not tall, with a face that had spent too much time in desert sun and not enough time in any kind of shade. He had the look of a man who had stopped thinking about certain things a long time ago. There are men like that. Their eyes have a particular quality, not cruel exactly, but empty in the place where doubt usually lives. "You see a woman," he said, not a question. I did something then that I had not planned. I said, "What woman?" The man looked at me for a long moment. He was reading me the way men like that read things, for use or inconvenience. I was a white man with a ranch, which gave me a certain limited standing even in the absence of authority. "Apache woman," he said, "running." "I've been working this fence since before sunup," I said. "Haven't seen anything but cattle and scrub jays." One of the others, younger, with something fervent and unpleasant in his expression, moved his horse sideways to look past me toward the barn. "What's in there?" he said. "Cattle," I said. "Horse feed." "Mind if we look?" "Actually," I said, and my heart was doing something I could feel in my fingertips, "I do." The silence that followed was not comfortable. The lead man looked at me. I looked at him. The morning was very bright and very still, and somewhere behind me a barn door was either open or closed, and I had no way of knowing which. "She's wanted," the lead man said, more conversationally now, like we were establishing terms. "Got a bounty out of Sonora. Woman killed a man." "Then you'll want the law," I said. "Not me." "Law's 2 days east." "Then you've got a 2-day ride," I said. "I can't help you." The lead man's face didn't change. That was what made it frightening, the absolute absence of visible process, the sense that whatever he decided next would arrive from some internal place I had no access to and no influence over. He looked at the barn again. Then he looked at the riders flanking him, 3 on his left, 2 on his right, and something passed between them that I didn't read in time. The 2 on the right started to split off. What I did next, I've thought about most days since. I don't know if it was brave. I don't think bravery is quite the right word for what happens when you act before you've had the chance to be properly afraid. I think the real word is something more like commitment. The moment when you've already set your hammer on the fence post and said what woman, and now you're just following the logic of what you've already decided to do, whether you meant to decide it or not. I stepped into the path of the 2 riders moving to flank. "This is my land," I said. "You don't have the right." The lead man said something in Spanish that I caught part of but not all of. What I caught was enough. "If you ride onto my land without permission," I said, keeping my voice level in the way my father had taught me, low, deliberate, because men who speak quietly are usually listened to before men who shout. "I'll report it as trespass to every land agent and deputy within 100 miles. I'll have your names and your horses described, and I'll put it in a letter to the territorial governor's office, and I'll send a copy to every newspaper I know of." I had no idea if any of that was true or effective. But I said it with the specific confidence of a man who keeps records. And men who keep records are, in the experience of most people, difficult and expensive to simply move past. The 2 riders on the right had stopped. The lead man studied me for a long moment. Then he said in English, "She killed a man." "Maybe she had reason," I said. That one surprised him. I saw it, a small flicker behind those emptied-out eyes. 4 days, he said finally, meaning he'd be back or meaning something would be. I wasn't certain. He reined his horse around. One by one, the others turned. They rode north, the way they'd come, and I stood in the open ground and watched them go until they'd cleared the ridge and disappeared. My hands were shaking slightly. I noticed this with the detached interest I usually reserve for weather readings. 6:31 a.m., I thought automatically. 17 minutes. I turned and walked to the barn. The door was partially open. She'd pulled it from the inside and left herself 6 inches of visibility, and the bars of morning light were coming through the gaps in the timber walls, and she was at the back of the space near the horse stall, standing very still with her back against the stone wall and the object in her right hand now visible. A knife, handled toward me, blade toward herself in a grip that told me she'd used it before and would again if she needed to. My horse, Esther, was regarding her with what I can only describe as calm approval. The woman looked at me. I said, "They're gone." She said nothing. I said, "I need to look at your arm." She looked at the arm, the dried blood above the elbow, and then back at me. Her breathing had evened out. She was still doing the arithmetic. I moved to the shelf on the east wall where I keep a tin box with the basic supplies. Not much. Clean cloth, a bottle of carbolic I'd bought from the doctor in Wilcox, some binding strips. I took them down and set them on the workbench, and then I stepped back. I didn't approach her. She needed to decide. I stood by the bench, and I waited, and outside the sun was coming fully above the ridge now, and the barn was filling with that specific morning light that makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and fragile. She moved to the bench. She sat. She put the knife on the bench beside her, not away but beside, within reach, and she held out her arm. Her eyes never fully left me. I cleaned the wound, a cut not deep but ragged, the kind made by wire or a sharp branch, and I bound it. She made no sound. Not when the carbolic touched it, which I knew from experience was not a pleasant sensation, and not when I tightened the binding. She looked at the wall above my head with an expression of absolute willful composure. But her hand, the free one, was pressed flat against her knee. I could see the tendons through the skin. When I finished, I stepped back to the workbench. I had half a piece of hardtack in my coat pocket, and I set it on the bench where she could reach it if she wanted to. She looked at it, she looked at me. She didn't take it. We stayed in the barn in that particular silence for a long time. Outside, the territory was doing what it always did, going on, indifferent, enormous and sunlit and old in ways that made everything I was worried about feel briefly small. I thought about writing the time down. I didn't. Some things I'd started to understand shouldn't be reduced to numbers. She didn't leave at dusk. I had expected her to. I told myself, in the way I tell myself things to avoid the anxiety of uncertainty, that she would slip out when the light failed, move back into the desert and whatever complicated fate awaited her there, and that I would close the barn door and write a very sparse entry in my log and try to sleep. I had the whole sequence planned. She was still in the barn when I came out to check the cattle at evening. Not hiding, not tucked into a corner. She was sitting on the packed earth near Esther's stall with her knees drawn up and her back against the timber partition, and Esther was showing considerable more interest in the visitor than she ever showed in me. The horse had her neck stretched out over the stall rail, nostrils working, and the woman had her hand raised with the backs of her fingers near the horse's muzzle, not touching, just offered. I stood in the barn doorway and watched this for longer than I should have. Then I went and did the cattle count and came back with 2 portions of what I had for dinner. Dried venison, some cornbread I'd made 3 days before that had achieved the structural integrity of a floor tile, and 2 cups of well water. I set 1 portion just inside the barn doorway, and I took mine to the porch and sat there in the cooling evening air and ate alone, which is what I always did. About 20 minutes later, I heard the faint sound of the tin cup. She'd eaten her. I wrote nothing in the log that night. I slept in pieces, which was normal, but the pieces were smaller than usual, and between them, I lay on my back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the lead writer's face when I said maybe she had reason. That flicker. That small human moment of surprise, in the middle of all that hollowed out certainty. I thought about the knife on the bench. I thought about her hand, pressed flat against her knee. She was awake before me. I know this because when I came out at 5:40 a.m. with the cold still in the air and my breath making small clouds, the barn door was open a precise 6 inches, the same 6 inches she'd arranged it the day before, and from inside I could hear the soft sound of Esther being spoken to. Not in English. In something low and rhythmic that wasn't quite singing, wasn't quite speech, but that Esther was clearly receptive to because the horse was making the small, contented sound she usually reserves for when I bring her an extra measure of oats. I stood outside the barn for a moment. Then I knocked on the timber frame. Stupid, you don't knock on barns, because it felt like the thing to do. The sound inside stopped. I came in. She was standing at Esther's stall with a piece of my horse's mane between her fingers and an expression on her face that was the closest thing to unguarded I'd yet seen from her. A softness that vanished the moment she registered my presence and rearranged itself into that watchful composure. But I'd seen it. Half a second. Enough. She had braided part of Esther's mane. A small, tight braid near the forelock decorated with something, a thin strip of leather dark red. Where she'd gotten it, I had no idea. Esther looked insufferably pleased with herself. I held up my hands, empty, in what I hoped was a recognizable gesture of peaceable intent, and I said, I need to talk to you. Nothing, the language barrier was solid. I'd known this, but I kept bumping against it anyway with the helpless frustration of a man who has only ever had to communicate in one direction. I tried something different. From my coat I pulled my log, a small leather-bound book my father had given me, now thick with years of entries. I opened it to a blank page near the back. I pulled out the pencil stub I keep tucked in the binding, and I began to draw. I am not an artist. My horse looked like a rectangle with legs. My barn looked like a box with a triangle on top. But I drew the 6 riders, 6 small figures on horseback, and then I drew them on the north side of my ranch boundary, and I put a large X through the path between them and the barn. She came closer. She looked at the drawing. I pointed north. I put up 6 fingers. Then I drew a new picture, the sun in a different position, lower, midday, and the riders, now with the suggestion of movement, going away. She looked at me. I shook my head. I didn't know if they were gone. That was the honest truth of it. I had no way of knowing if they'd actually left the territory or simply repositioned. What I knew was that she couldn't stay in this barn indefinitely, and I couldn't keep standing between her and them without a better plan than let me explain trespass law to armed men. I drew a 3rd picture. It wasn't very good, but it was a figure, a woman moving west, and west in my drawing had mountains, the dragoons. She looked at the mountains. Something shifted in her face. Not relief, nothing that simple. Something more complicated, more interior. Recognition, maybe. Or the particular expression a person gets when a thing they've been trying not to hope for suddenly becomes visible. She took the pencil from my hand. I let her. She turned to a fresh area of the page and she drew something. She was quick, much more precise than me, a few careful lines that resolved into a ridge I recognized. Dews Cabses, the 2-peaked formation visible from the eastern edge of my property on clear mornings. Then she marked something in the hills, a location. She looked at me. I looked at the drawing. Then I looked at her. "You're trying to get back," I said. The words fell into the air between us, useless as language, but the thought behind them was real. She wasn't just running. She had a destination. She handed the pencil back, and she sat down in the same spot against the partition. And she closed her eyes briefly in a way that was not sleep, but was something close to it. The way a person looks when they have been running on will for a long time, and the will is still intact, but the flesh is beginning to file its objections. I went to make coffee. The second day was different from the first in the way that familiarity is different from strangeness. You begin to notice smaller things. She was left-handed. I noticed this from the way she held things, the way she moved in space. She was also, I came to understand, in some kind of physical discomfort beyond the arm wound, something in how she moved when she thought I wasn't watching, a careful management of her left side. She'd fallen at some point, or been thrown, something. I didn't know how to address this without making it worse. I put more carbolic and clean cloth on the workbench without comment and went out to work. When I came back at midday, she'd used them. The old cloth was set aside with the careful precision of someone raised to not waste things. She'd also, I noticed, taken 3 items from my barn without asking. A length of rope, a particular kind of knot I use on the fence ties, and apparently studied both and replaced them. Not taken, studied. As if she was assessing what kind of man kept what kind of equipment and drew what kind of conclusions. I found this, for reasons I didn't examine closely, reassuring. The afternoon was long. I worked the north fence, staying aware of the ridgeline, the habit of watching now reactivated in a way that reminded me of my father's stories about the earliest years of the ranch. He'd watched that ridge constantly. Over time, the watching had faded into something more passive. Now I watched again. Nothing came. The day was hot, then cooler, then the light began its long southward tilt. I checked the cattle. I ate on the porch. She ate in the barn. She'd found the oats and helped herself to a small portion, less than I'd have offered and exactly what she needed. And I thought, this is someone who knows the mathematics of survival, who takes what is necessary and not what is comfortable. It was getting dark when she came to the porch. Not all the way, she stood at the edge of the porch boards in the threshold where the roof's shadow met the open evening air. She had something in her hands. She held it out. It was a small figure, 4 inches long, made from pieces of my fence wire bent with extraordinary precision into the shape of a horse. A running horse. Every leg in the right position for a gallop, the neck forward, the mane suggested in a series of thin parallel wires. She had made it while I was working. I took it from her hands. I turned it over. It was, by any measure, beautiful, the work of someone who understood both material and form and had the patience to bend wire to an exact vision. She pointed at Esther's stall, then she pointed at me. For you, for the horse, for us, I wasn't certain which. I looked up at her. She was watching me with that calculating look, but there was something else in it now, something that had a question in it. An uncertain question, not like the arithmetic she'd been doing all yesterday about exits and threats. Something smaller and more human. I set the wire horse very carefully on the porch rail. I said, "Thank you." The words were again useless, but the tone of them landed somewhere. I watched it land. She looked at the wire horse. A muscle in her jaw moved. She turned and went back into the barn. I sat on the porch for a long time after. The riders came back at 2 in the morning. I wasn't asleep. I rarely sleep past 1, and I heard the horses at the water trough to the north, the sound of them before I saw anything. I was at the window with my rifle in 20 seconds. There were 3 of them this time, the lead man and 2 others, not the same 2 from before. They didn't approach the barn. They sat their horses at the north fence for a long time, looking at the property, testing something, waiting to see if anything moved. A lantern was lit in my window, the lamp I'd left burning, and maybe that was enough to make them hesitant, or maybe they were simply gathering information. Assessing. After 40 minutes, they rode north. I stayed at the window until I was sure. Then I went to the barn. She was awake. Of course she was awake. She was at the barn door with it open precisely 6 inches, and she had seen what I had seen or heard what I had heard, and her face, in the thin lamplight I carried, was something I had no vocabulary for. Not fear, not quite. Something more ancient than fear. Something that had been living in her body for long enough that it had become structural, load-bearing, part of the frame. I held up 3 fingers, pointed north. She nodded once. I drew in the air, sun, horizon, early morning, and then I drew a walking motion with 2 fingers. Tomorrow before full light. She understood. I could see her understanding it, the way the thing settled into her posture, the slight shift of some internal weight. I said, "I'll take you as far as the Eastern Trail," and then, because language was useless, "I'll go with you." I pointed at myself, then at the mountains in the distance, invisible in the dark but present in the way mountains are always present even when you can't see them. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something in Apache, 3 words, soft and precise, that I did not understand and have spent considerable time since trying to describe and never satisfactorily could. I went back inside. I did not sleep. We rode out in the dark. I had Esther. She walked by her own choice, which I only understood after we'd been moving for 20 minutes, and she showed no sign of wanting to mount. She moved alongside the horse in the way of someone who trusts their own feet more than any animal, and who has reasons for that trust that are not available to me. I shortened Esther's pace. We moved west and south, working toward the old goat trail that cuts up through the Dragoon foothills, following the Arroyo's sound on our left. The desert in the hour before dawn is a different country than any of its daytime versions. The sounds are low and specific. The air has a coldness in it that doesn't feel like weather but like the land exhaling, releasing everything it absorbed in the day and breathing out something old and mineral and impersonal. I've worked in it my whole life, and I still don't feel like it belongs to me that hour. I feel like a visitor. She moved through it like a resident. I don't mean that I was slow. I know this country. I know where the ground drops and where the rocks are loose and where the arroyo bends and cuts back. But there is knowing land and there is being in land, and they are different categories. She was in it. She made decisions ahead of where I would have made them, angling around things I wouldn't have noticed until I was already in the middle of them, moving with a fluency that was not effort but something preceding effort, instinct that had been learned so thoroughly it had become cellular. For the first hour, we didn't try to communicate at all. The dark was enough. I had my rifle across the saddle in a position I could use quickly, and I was watching the ridgeline to the north with the attention I'd rediscovered yesterday. And she was doing her own watching. Different angles, different patterns, which told me she was not simply following but navigating, cross-referencing, running some internal map that was probably more detailed and more reliable than anything I possessed. Twice she stopped. Both times she held up a hand, flat stop, and I stopped Esther without question, and we stood in the dark listening, and both times after a long moment she moved again. I don't know what she heard or didn't hear, what she felt, what told her it was safe to continue. But I didn't ask. Asking wasn't the currency of this particular transaction. The second time, just before she moved, she glanced back at me. It was a quick look, functional, assessing, but within it for a half-second was something else. An acknowledgement, not gratitude exactly. Something more lateral than gratitude, more between equals, the look you might give a person who has been demonstrating, somewhat to your surprise, that they can be relied upon. I kept moving. We hit trouble at the base of the first proper climb. The trail through the Dragoons narrows where it begins to ascend, threading between two rock formations that funnel wind and anyone moving through them into a predictable line. I knew this, but I knew it from the perspective of someone who has only ever passed through it alone and without urgency. I was thinking about the terrain. She was thinking about what could be waiting in it. She stopped me 30 yards back from the narrows. Hard stop, hand up, a firm lateral cut of the wrist that meant stay. She moved forward without me, keeping to the left where the shadow of the western formation fell across the ground, moving low and deliberately, and she was at the mouth of the narrows in 60 seconds, and she spent 2 full minutes there, still reading it. Then she came back. She looked at me and drew a line in the air, a path, and then swept her hand in a wide arc to the right, around, another way. I looked at the narrows, then at the arc her hand had indicated. The other way was longer, significantly, and rougher. We'd be picking through broken country without a trail in the dark, with the sun starting to come in an hour. I thought about the riders, 3 of them repositioned last night assessing. I took the arc. She found the path. This is what I mean about being in the land versus knowing it. I could not have done what she did in the next 90 minutes. She moved through country that had no trail and made it navigable anyway, reading surfaces I couldn't read, testing with her foot before committing her weight, finding the line through boulder fields and tilted rock slabs with a precision I could only follow. Esther picked her way behind her with calm trust. I held the rifle and watched the dark behind us. At some point during this, I stopped thinking about the riders at all. Not because the danger had passed, it hadn't, but because the work of following was demanding enough to fill whatever space anxiety usually occupies. There is something to be said for hard physical attention. It is its own kind of relief. The sun came over the Dews Cabses at 6:52 a.m. I know the time because I checked automatically, the way I always do when something changes. In the light, everything reorganized. The landscape stopped being a series of immediate problems and became visible. Enormous and layered, the desert spreading east from our position, the ranch somewhere in that brown and green distance, the ridgelines I'd been watching for 2 days now visible and critically empty. She stopped where the ground leveled. She turned and looked east for a long moment. Not at anything specific, just looked. In the morning light I could see things I hadn't been able to see in the barn or hadn't let myself look at in the barn. A rope burn on her wrist, old, healed. A small scar at her jaw, barely visible. The way she stood, not straight exactly, but centered. Arranged around her own core in a way that spoke of someone who had had to locate that core and hold it deliberately, through difficulty, over time. She said something. I waited. She looked at me and she said it again, and from the sound of it and the way her eyes had changed. Less calculating, something more forward-facing, I understood it as something like a name. Not her own, someone else's. She pointed east and up her drawing, Dews Cabses. She pointed toward the hills above us. She was telling me where she was going. She was telling me who was there. I said, someone's waiting for you. Useless, language useless. But she seemed to read the question in my face and she nodded, once definitive. Yes, someone is waiting. I thought about that. Someone who had been waiting through whatever had happened to bring her running across my land in the early morning with blood on her arm, and everything riding on whether a stranger at a fence post with a hammer was the type of man to say what woman when asked a direct question. I should explain what happened next. I had intended to stop at the base of the trail. That had been my plan, walk her to the edge of the rough country, point toward the high ground and turn back. The ranch had been unattended since 4:30 a.m. I had cattle to count, fence work unfinished, and somewhere to the north 3 men who might be carrying information about what I'd done back to whoever employed them. I had intended to stop. Instead, I tied Esther to a scrub oak and said, I'll go a little farther. I don't know why I said it. She wouldn't understand the words. But I said it, and she waited, and I came with her up the first long switchback. The trail opened onto a small mesa, a flat, grass-scattered shelf of rock about 30 yards across, and she stopped when she reached it and made a sound that was not loud, not calling, but that carried in the morning air with a specific frequency. A moment later, from the rocks above, a figure appeared. A boy, 12, maybe 13. He moved in the careful way of someone who has been waiting a long time in a place they weren't sure was safe, and his face when he saw her. I don't write about other people's faces often. I'm a record keeper, not a poet. Times and temperatures and cattle counts. But his face, it was the face of someone who has been holding something terrible at arm's length for a long time, and has now been allowed to put it down. The release of it visible across every muscle, instantaneous, overwhelming. His whole structure reorganizing around the fact of her presence in the way a structure reorganizes around the return of something load-bearing. He came down the rocks quickly, and she moved to him, and there was a brief, fierce exchange. Not argument, not just reunion. Something that had all the texture of a longer conversation, the kind where the main thing being communicated is I am here, I am still here. She touched his face. He looked past her at me. I took a step back. The boy said something, she answered. He looked at me again, assessing, much the same way she'd looked at me outside the barn, though less concealed. The full, frank regard of a young person who hasn't yet learned to hide what they see. He said one word in English. It was why. Directed at me. I thought about it. Because there was no good reason not to, I said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was something I was still working out. He translated, or summarized, I couldn't tell, for her. She looked at me. She said something short. He turned to me. She says the man you hid her from, he said, working the English carefully, killed her husband. The word husband landed differently than I expected. I looked at her. The composure was intact. She was watching me with a measuring look. But underneath it, underneath the architecture of a person who has taught themselves to carry weight without showing the carrying, was something much more tired. I'm sorry, I said. She didn't understand the words. But something in my face apparently said them adequately, because she looked at me for a long moment, and then briefly she looked away. At the desert below, at the distance. We went up another 100 yards before I genuinely stopped. The trail narrowed to something that could only take one person at a time, and above the boy had indicated with a gesture that there were others. Her people, I understood, waiting. This was as far as I went. We both seemed to know it without discussion. She turned to face me. I had nothing to give her. I was aware of this as a specific kind of deficiency. I had a rifle which wasn't appropriate. I had hardtack which felt absurd. I had my log which she'd already drawn in. I had the log. I tore out the page with her drawing, the ridge Dews Cabses marked, the mountains I now recognized, and I folded it and held it out. She looked at it. She took it. Then she reached into the fold of her dress, and she withdrew something and she held it out to me. It was a single eagle feather, small, not a primary, not the ceremonial kind I'd seen pictures of. A secondary feather, dark-banded, worn smooth at the spine from handling, something kept for a long time. I looked at it. I looked at her. I can't, I started. She pressed it into my hand. The boy said something that might have been you'd better take it, but I'm reading in tone there. I took it. She said something, 3 words, the same 3 words she'd said in the barn the night before, quietly at the threshold, and then she turned and went up the trail with the boy beside her. I stood on the open ground and watched until the trail curved, and the rock face took them. I want to be precise about the descent back to the ranch, because in the log I've tried to be precise about everything. I was on Esther. The sun was fully up, the desert going gold and harsh and enormous around me, and I was riding back east through the broken country, and I was thinking about what I'd written in that log for 6 years. Feed counts, water table readings, post replacements, first frost. I was thinking about what my father had said. A man who doesn't record what he's seen hasn't really seen anything. I had seen things these 2 days. I wasn't sure all of them were recordable. The 3 riders had not returned. I didn't know if they would. I had a description of the lead man in my memory, and I did eventually write a letter to the deputy in Wilcox, not accusatory because I had no standing to accuse and no legal framework to use, but descriptive. I described them. I described what they'd done. I put it in writing, which is what I know how to do. I don't know what came of it. The wire horse sat on my porch rail for 3 weeks before I moved it inside. It's on the windowsill now in the light, and Esther has stopped being smug about it. I still keep the feather in the log, pressed flat between 2 pages. There's something I've been trying to write these past weeks, and I keep arriving at the edge of it and stopping. It has to do with the boy's question. Why? I gave him the answer that was available to me in the moment. No good reason not to, and I've been turning it over since. It's not wrong, exactly. It is the truth of the moment. But it's incomplete. The way records are always incomplete. They capture the what and the when, but they never fully capture the thing underneath those things. The thing underneath was this. She was running. And something in me, something older than calculation, older than whatever strategic self-interest I might dress up as principle, something in me recognized that run, not from experience. I've never run from writers, but I recognized what it meant for someone to run and to have to trust a stranger with the direction of that run. I recognized the arithmetic of bad options. I recognized the hand pressed flat against the knee. I've been alone on this land for 6 years. I know what it costs to hold things together when no one is watching. I understood, without needing her language, what it meant to be moving under the weight of something heavy and to keep moving anyway. I understood something else, too, something about what the land asks of the people in it. My father thought the land was his because he'd built a barn and counted the cattle and marked the graves. I've thought that, too. It's possible we were both wrong. Possible the land is more indifferent than that. More patient. Possible it doesn't belong to any of us but simply continues, and what we do in it, how we behave in the specific moments when behaving well costs something, is the only record that matters. I'm writing this down. I don't know who'll read it. Maybe no one. The log is for me, mostly. A man who doesn't record what he's seen. But I want to have recorded this. The morning she walked out of the cedars, the hammer on the post, the word I said, "What woman?" before I knew I was going to say it. The feather in the book. And somewhere above the Dews Cabeses, in country I don't know and never will, the sound of a woman saying 3 words I don't understand to a boy whose face changed completely when he saw her.